Now on to today's session. Let's make unfair housing history. Please welcome Chad Lassiter and Richard Strom. Richard is the 2023 chairperson of our Diversity and Inclusion Committee. He is here to moderate today's session, and he will also introduce you to our guest speaker. Richard?
Thank you very much, Paula, and welcome everybody. I'm very pleased to have Chad Lassiter here today. I do want to say a few things about Mr. Lassiter. Chad is a national expert in the field of American race relations. Mr. Lassiter has worked on race, peace, and poverty-related issues in the United States of America, Africa, Canada, Haiti, Israel, and Norway. He is the current executive director of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, where over his 4 years in this position, he has continued to push the Commonwealth forward in the spaces of DEI training, unconscious bias training, anti-racism training, and has developed and launched a No Hate in Our State town hall to address the surge of white nationalism in Pennsylvania, a social justice lecture series providing an outlet for the communities in the state to discuss imperative issues, and serves as a racial reduction response team for those communities impacted by hatred. He oversees a staff of 87 with 3 regional offices in Pennsylvania that comprise all 67 counties and manages an annual budget of $11 million. Now, Mr. Lassiter received his master's degree from the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Social Work, where he was the A. Philip Randolph Award winner in 2001 and was the recipient of the prestigious University of Pennsylvania's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Community Involvement Award in 2008. Mr. Lassiter is a co-founder and current president of the University of Pennsylvania's School of Social Policy and Practices Black Men at Penn, the first Ivy League Black male group of social workers. Since 2003, this transcendent group has sought to recruit Black males into the profession, as well as provide anti-racism and violence prevention training to urban and suburban schools around the country, and diversity and inclusion training for corporate entities and penal systems. Now, Mr. Lassiter has been recognized by the Philadelphia Tribune as the most influential African-American leader from 2010 to 2022, as Who's Who Among African-Americans 17th edition in 2004, with such notables as Colin Powell and Michael Jordan. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Lassiter to the Tri-County Suburban Realtors. Chad?
Good morning. Thank you so much, Richard, for that amazing introduction. And I say amazing because you read it with such enthusiasm. I'm looking to my left and my right, and I'm just like, I'm 6'6", but I feel so much taller. So thank you for certainly having me here. Want to thank Paula. Let me just fundamentally say that I'm humbled and honored to be in this space. I also have to note that I'm still a student of the Fair Housing Act. I'm still learning, just like all of us are. I'm aided, though, admirably by our Director of Fair Housing and Commercial Property, Director Adrian Garcia here at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. But nevertheless, I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to get through my slides, but also Richard and I have some questions that we'll be going back and forth with regards to frank, organic, and fluid conversation. This is going to be interactive. I know that we have me here from 10 o'clock to 11:30. I have been blessed, though this is Holy Week, with this thing called the gift of gab. But I can assure you that I'm not going to speak for all 90 minutes. But I am appreciative of the invite. And once again, I'm humbled and I'm honored to be here. If we could start with the very first slide.
And Chad, while we're getting that up, I would like to let everybody in the group today know that we have disabled the Q&A box. We will only be using the chat box for today's session, but you'll find that button down at the bottom of your screen. If you do have questions and comments, please input it into that box.
Thank you so much, Richard. So I have an opening statement, and that opening statement is as follows. Our country's history and the actions of our government, along with lending institutions, developers, and the insurance industry, have played a role in segregating our communities to the benefit of the majority market. Redlining, urban renewal, blockbusting, slum clearance, and exclusionary zoning are but a few of the policy examples of this, the latter of which persists today throughout the United States of America. Pennsylvania is a commonwealth, and as such, the power is entrusted to the people, and in our case, the smaller governmental entities, an example, cities, counties, boroughs, townships. And so today, what I want to do is show how this concept of we the people can speak back to the elites and recognizing, having a true acknowledgement of forms of unlawful discrimination and the indices of housing and the violations of the Fair Housing Act. So I open up with not a Socratic statement, but fair housing in Pennsylvania is your right. And that right is on every side of the color line. That right is on every side of the gender line. Next slide. So the presentation objectives for today is as follows: provide a brief overview of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. I think that's important because sometimes people don't know that we're the top civil rights enforcing agency in the Commonwealth. And when they hear human relations, oftentimes they think it's synonymous with human resources or human management or things of that nature, HR. So I'll talk briefly about the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. Provide a brief overview of what the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission does, a review briefly of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. I don't come to this context thinking that everyone knows what fair housing is, but we'll look at what fair housing is, what housing discrimination is, and given the synopsis of what this title and this whole entire presentation was, recognizing, but to recognize means that we have to do something about it. So recognizing unfair housing, combating unfair housing, and then ultimately, what does social justice accountability look like for all of us? And then how to report fair housing violations, and then the Q&A. Next slide. So we open up with an assignment for you all. And one thing that Richard didn't mention is that I used to be a former college professor at the University of Pennsylvania. So I'm putting my professorial hat on. And just briefly in the chat, you're going to write who you think that the first quote is attributed to. And that quote is, life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? So take some time to put in the chat who you think this quote is attributed to. Winston Churchill, MLK, Lincoln, Aristotle, MLK, JFK. Okay, let's take a few more moments. MLK. Okay, and those who said MLK, you're absolutely right. Martin Luther King said, life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? And I chose that quote because it's very important, given the context that we see Martin Luther King as not only a civil rights leader, but a human rights leader, but he first got his start as a fair housing advocate, moving from the South to the North in the boroughs of Chicago, recognizing that he saw a despair, a colony of despair, of depression, of decadence, of hopelessness, of nihilism in Chicago, in the North, just as he saw in the South. And it was in the North, in Chicago, that he first recognized housing inequality. So I wanted to put King into the context of fair housing. The second quote, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual doom. Spend some time and put in the chat, who do you think this quote is attributed to? We hear MLK. JFK, Jesse Jackson, MLK. Thank you, Dawn. MLK. Thank you, Jennifer. Eisenhower. Okay. Thank you, Richard. Someone put a question mark. That's a brutally honest response. Thank you. Take a few more moments. MLK. MLK. I tell you, this is really an alive group so far. And I'm going to match your synergies, your intellectual property, and hopefully your passion. Alexander, okay. Let's take one more minute. MLK. Thank you, Meredith. And someone said Mr. Lassiter. Okay. Roosevelt. MLK. All right. I wish that this quote was attributed to me, but this quote is once again attributed to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and he was talking about the triple evils of militarism, poverty, and racism. And so when you look at some of the challenges that we're going to be looking at as it relates to Fair Housing Act violations, housing discrimination, appraisal discrimination, and all those things that we have come to know as it relates to housing, we're spending a lot of money in a lot of areas of mental defense, then on programs of social uplift, leveling the playing field. And when we talk about housing discrimination, oftentimes for me, I think that the conversation has to be expanded, that we have individuals who live in rural areas, suburban areas, as well as urban areas that are faced with housing discrimination. So thank you so much for those of you who participated. Let's go to the next slide and we'll go ahead and jump into our presentation for today. I think it's very important, Richard, for everyone here to recognize that though we are the top civil rights enforcement agency in the Commonwealth, we engage in trainings for ourselves. And so I wanted to provide this as a visual for those of you to see that the implicit bias trainings for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission was led by the Anti-Defamation League. And as you see, we had it in February for our Philadelphia Regional Office on February 10th, our Harrisburg and Regional Office February 15th, and then lastly, our Pittsburgh Regional Office February 23rd. So theoretically, we are the top civil rights enforcement agency, and from a practice implementation standpoint, we are as well. So we do a lot of these trainings, but we also come to the context with our own isms. So for me to sit here and give this presentation and say, I've been absent and void all of my life with no display of toxic masculinity or cool pose or machismo is a lie. Always being aware of my isms. And so in order for us to do this work, it's important for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission to be aware of those forms of xenophobia, those forms of isms. And so as we build upon this presentation today and this conversation, I think it's very important for us to recognize that even within real estate, even within banking, even within financing, even within appraisal and underwriting, we should be looking at implicit bias trainings. And a lot of this will come alive as we go through this. Next slide. So in context, who is the PHRC and what do we do? Next slide. We started in 1945, where a bill was introduced, but it wasn't until 1952 that the Industrial Relations Commission report actually brought into fruition what we see today. 1,200 PA employees were surveyed. 40% were, they were asked, how many of you would hire African Americans to work in positions here in state government? 40% would not hire African Americans in unskilled positions. These are unskilled positions. 50% would not hire African Americans in semi-skilled positions. More than 60% would not hire African Americans for professional positions or public contacts. So in 1955, the commission was established as the Fair Employment Practices Commission. 1961 to present, our name was acquired and jurisdiction was brought in to include the areas of housing, public accommodations, including schools. 1968, the commission was transferred from the Department of Labor to the governor's office. We are now celebrating just completed our 67th year. We're in our 68th year, and I'm blessed and fortunate to be the 5th executive director in the storied history of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. Next slide, please. So our mission is two-part, kind of similar to what we're going to be talking about with the Fair Housing Act, two parts of the Fair Housing Act. Our two-part mission is to enforce PA non-discrimination laws. That's our PHRA, our Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, our PA Fair Educational Opportunities Act, all with the goal of promoting equal opportunity for all in PA. For some in PA? No, for all in PA. So that means that everyone in PA should be able to be protected and should be protected with regards to equal opportunities in this great state. Next slide. Community relations, we have key partnerships. You see that some of these partnerships are with our PA Attorney General, our PA State Police, other local, state, and federal partners, and certainly with the fair housing work that we've done under Director Garcia and our Fair Housing Outreach Coordinator, Brittany Millinger. Yes, individuals and entities like you fall under our partnerships, and we're so glad to be part of the concept of making sure that we promote fair housing. We have PHRC advisory councils. We oftentimes say that they are our eyes and ears, but more than that, they are individuals who are fighting justice. They are the ones who will bring to us some of the challenges with housing discrimination, employment discrimination, discrimination with regards to public accommodations, discrimination as it relates to disability, and all of the protected classes. Next slide, please. We're good at this part of outreach. We don't always want to just be reactionary. So how can we support communities? And we support communities with trainings, on-site webinars, social justice series. We have a No Hate in Our State town hall, which looks at the surge of white nationalism, white supremacy in the Commonwealth. Our PHRC social justice lecture series that bring in people from around the country, but also in our Commonwealth that can talk about issues of social justice. We've had Anita Hill in the past. We just most recently had Melissa Harris Perry. We've had Tim Wise. Maybe some of you know some of these people. We've had Eddie Glaude. Our PHRC Lunch and Learns, we've had people in the housing space come and talk about appraisal bias, hoarding, combating housing discrimination along the indices of sexual harassment. PHRC Speaks, looking at some of what your organization is doing in the DEI space. PHRC Diversity Speaks is something new to the PHRC as it relates to bringing in thought leaders in the DEI space, which we know now is JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, as well as just framing things around diversity, equity, inclusion in housing, in banking, in loaning, in lending. Our PHRC Fair Housing Conference, we'll give you some information before the day concludes. It's going to be in June at the Weizmann American Jewish Museum here in Philadelphia. We're keeping our fingers crossed because we're hoping that the keynote speaker will be none other than United States Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Secretary Fudge, as we sent her an invite. And then our PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century. I don't want to get ahead of my presentation, but when we talk about what are those things that we can do, Pennsylvania Cable Network, we can reach out to them, partner with them. That's what the PHRC has done. We air this PHRC Speaks Fair Housing in the 21st Century show the first and third Sunday of every month, and we're in our 4th season. So it runs the gamut of a lot of what you spoke about, Richard, fair housing testing and things of that nature. We bring realtors on, we bring appraisers on, we bring bankers on, we bring individuals to have those frank conversations, putting the metaphoric elephant in the room as it relates to gentrification and things of that nature. So just wanted to show you some of the promoting of equal opportunity and some of our initiatives at the PHRC. Next slide. We have the entire Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is comprised of 67 counties. So you see a visual, maybe you're from one of these counties, perhaps, but we have the entire Commonwealth with 3 regional offices. As you see, I'm not going to spend much time on the screen, but Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, and Philadelphia, 67 counties. Complaints come into one of those 3 offices. We investigate those complaints. Next slide. What and who does the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act cover? I'm checking in on our post to make sure everyone's okay and that you're still with me. I'm not going to bore you with this. Trust me, trust the process. we're going to have a great time this morning. Next slide. We cover employment, housing, commercial property, public accommodations, and education. I highlighted housing because that's very germane to the work that you all do. A lot of folks don't know that there is a PHRA. They know about the Fair Housing Act, but do they know about the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act? And so when individuals are violating individuals who are looking for housing, they can file a complaint with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. Because once again, remember the second slide was everyone has the right to housing. Next slide. What classes are protected? You see the classes: race or color, sex, age, religion, national origin, ancestry, disability, familial status, as well as making sure that individuals are not retaliated against. Next slide. So thank you so much, Paula, for helping me in this space. What is the Fair Housing Act? Once again, you heard me say that I didn't want to come into this context thinking that everyone knew what the Fair Housing Act was. I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence if you do know what the Fair Housing Act is. So this slide I will not read. I will leave to you to actually just take it in. And oftentimes silence is very powerful as well. Next slide. Fair Housing Act of 1968 had two primary goals: to prevent discrimination. The Fair Housing Act protects people from discrimination when they are renting or buying a home. So I'm going to stop there. Put in the chat if you believe that individuals who are discriminating against someone with regards to purchasing a home, renting a home, know in fact that they're discriminating. Let's spend some time in that space. Put in the chat. So the Fair Housing Act protects people from discrimination when they are renting or buying. Someone says probably, someone, okay, not always. I believe many do. Not always, often not. Yes, at times. I think some do, some don't. Sometimes no. Very often, yes. Oh, I like it. Not always. Okay. Often they do know. Yes. I think most often some are just so ignorant of their own ignorance. Wow. Okay. Not always. Okay. I'm not going to personalize this, but I'll just simply say this. If that question was personalized, and we personalized the question, and the question was, someone said, I think they are very aware and know there will be no consequences. Okay. Lack of knowledge. Okay. Okay. All right. Let's stop the chat right there. Thank you. So when I mention about personalizing it, I don't want to bring you down to elementary level, but a bully knows when they're bullying someone. And the person who's being bullied, they might have sweaty palms. They may feel a level of anxiousness. They may go through a period of darkness, a period of depression. So when we're looking at the Fair Housing Act protects people from discrimination when they are renting or buying a home, getting a mortgage, seeking housing assistance, or engaging in other housing-related activities. When Richard mentioned testing, and I come with my African-American wife to a home to see the home, and that realtor tells me, oh, the home is no longer on the market. And a white couple comes to that same home, or an Asian American Pacific Islander couple. And sometimes they're discriminated too, because they're sometimes looked at as BIPOC, people of color as well. But let's stay in that black-white, and I'm not trying to seduce you into the black-white binary, but that white couple, they come. And they're told, oh yes, come on in. You know, the home has been on the market for a considerable period of time. The shower of that home has to know that they're doing something nefarious. Redlining, when your credit score is 750 and you have all the things that you need, that lender has to know that they're doing something nefarious. When you're looking at Secretary Fudge, and I was at a meeting last year with Secretary Fudge and Vice President Harris at the National Urban League Conference in Washington, D.C. And Secretary Fudge shared a candid story of how she has a home with larger square footage and a lot that she owns directly next to her home. And her neighbor who lives 2 blocks down, home has less square footage, not the same amount of bedrooms, not the same amount of bathrooms, and her white neighbor 2 blocks down house appraises for more than her house. Don't focus on the identity of her being Secretary Fudge. That's insignificant. The mere fact that you have African Americans and others who have to take off African American art off of their walls. They have to make their homes less appealing from a culturally relevant standpoint. I'm not here to castigate anyone, but I think that when we are looking at the way the question was positioned, I think it's both and. Sometimes people don't know, but after the day, we should be able to take this data and we should be able to put this data after this conversation, this presentation, and give it to others so that they know that fundamentally, you know what you're doing. And I think it goes back to what someone said, that there's no consequences, because we're not simply saying you just violated the Fair Housing Act. But I respect everything that everyone put in. I don't placate, ingratiate, nor do I display with false generosity. But I think that people who marginalize and oppress people oftentimes know that they're marginalizing and oppressing people. Maybe they don't, but we'll see by the end of the day what data we could possess qualitatively and quantitatively to speak back to levels of accountability and what was mentioned in your synopsis, which is recognizing. So let's go to the next slide. Reversing housing discrimination, affirmatively furthering fair housing, taking meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based on protected characteristics, right? We never talk about how racism disadvantages those who engage in racism. You're living in a catchment area, it's homogeneous or it's diverse, and all of a sudden, Asian American Pacific Islander or a Latinx family or African American family or interracial family or LGBT family moves on the block, and because of your own built-in forms of bigotry, discrimination, or racism, you want to move out of the community. Well, now you have to figure out purchasing another home, selling the current home, the upheaval that may exist with moving your children out of a community that they were familiar with, the context of interacting with one another, losing that aspect of children now saying, hey, listen, this is my best friend. You know, he happens to be African American or she happens to be Asian American Pacific Islander. What do you mean we're moving out of this community? So we never talk about that. But once again, the second part of the Fair Housing Act primary goal is to reverse housing segregation, or what Doug Massey talks about in his book, American Apartheid. Next slide. I wanted us to see a visual of your fair housing rights, and fair housing law protects all Pennsylvanians from unlawful housing discrimination based on these indices here. I want us to go to the chat, and I want us to put in one word that describes you as a realtor. There may be a plethora of words, but for those of you who are realtors or housing advocates, one word that describes you. Compassionate, kind, dedicated, thorough, honest, thorough, empathy, caring, nurturing, pleasant, dedicated, patient, ethical, intentional, honest, dreamer. Oh, wow. These are educator. These are powerful. They're powerful, Richard. Ethical. Advocate. Advisor. Okay. Working in your best interest. Trustworthy. Now, what I would like for you to do is spend some time in the chat and advocate. Okay. Thank you, Florence. Now what I would like for you to do is spend some time in the chat and just spend some time here and write what unfair housing practices look like for you. What unfair housing practices look like for you? Low appraisals. Higher interest rates. Richard, what I'm going to do now is there's two types of people that oftentimes engage in my presentation, those who volunteer and those who I call upon. I want Jennifer, who said, let me first and foremost, from a strengths-based perspective, acknowledge that all of these are powerful. I want Jennifer to share what she wrote. I want Richard to share what he wrote, Aaron to share what he wrote. Aaron wrote 4 powerful things. I also want Florence to share, Elizabeth, Christina, and Meredith in that order. So could we open with Jennifer, if you're comfortable?
I can do that for you. So I'll allow Jennifer to talk. Jen, you can unmute yourself and.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning, how are you?
Doing well, Jennifer.
Good, so for this recent question, the 2 things that I shared were not giving everyone the same quality of the guidance and information. And then unequal exposure to opportunities and their choice of their houses or neighborhoods.
Thank you, Jennifer.
You're welcome.
Richard.
I put down that it can be very subtle sometimes, such as when you are working with a landlord trying to find them a tenant, when you present them with a tenant who is qualified in every parameter that the landlord has used, and then the landlord says, well, I'd like to meet them in person before signing the lease. And in many ways, we walk that tightrope of wanting to make sure that we stay legal and fair, but also want to make sure that we keep our clients. And we have to be able to manage our clients' own inherent biases. Why would they really want to meet a prospective tenant in person if that person has already been qualified? And I don't know about for all the other realtors on this call. Have you come across this? Because I've seen this quite often.
Good point. Aaron.
Go ahead, Aaron.
I put, am I answering both questions or just the last one?
The last one.
The last one I put lower.
Yeah, the one I asked.
Low appraisals, higher interest rates, bias treatment from other realtors.
Thank you, Aaron.
You're welcome.
Florence.
Hang on. Okay, Florence, go ahead. Flo Baja, are you there?
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Good
Oh,
morning.
good. Thank you. Good morning. My clients were discriminated against because of their last name and their nationality on getting a mortgage. They were actually under contract, and someone from the company confidentially told me that somebody didn't like the last name, and the reason that they were denied the loan was actually legitimate, but they could have pushed it the other way and gotten it through, and I knew it. And so I got them another house in a heartbeat, and we switched lenders, but I was just like practically in tears. I just thought, this is so wrong.
So think about this and stay with me, Florence. Think about this, everyone. Florence was in near tears. That's Florence's admission. That's her evoked emotion. We can't even begin to fathom what the other individuals were feeling. That's the trauma that sometimes lays latent, and then there becomes a vicarious traumatization if you're in that space for a considerable period of time. What was the last name, by the way, Florence?
Well, it was Shaker, which is very innocent, but without, oh dear, I'm talking about my clients. I was, I
Well, you can
can't
give us a
say,
pseudonym. You don't have to give us the
it
last
was
name.
a very American sounding name, but
Okay.
their occupation and a lot of other details came to light, which the lenders figured it out because of it was a partnership, and the other partner had a different last name that was more distinguishable without going into more detail. But
Gotcha.
it
No,
was just, it broke my heart.
yeah, no, we have the context. Thank you so much. Elizabeth, you put some powerful stuff in there as well. Good morning, Elizabeth.
Beth and Jersey, can you unmute yourself? There you go.
I'm sorry, I wasn't sure if it was me. So what I had put in was not treating everyone the same. Specifically, when somebody calls and you speak to a client in a certain way, and then if another client calls and they have an accent or you have a hard time understanding them, you don't spend the same amount of time with them. And that to me is discrimination.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It goes back to something that one of our colleagues put in the chat, empathy. If we see the humanity of all individuals, it doesn't matter if their last name is Stein, Katz, Littman, Berkowitz, Fitzpatrick, Jackson, Lassiter, Smith, Johnson, does not matter because fundamental to the core of who they are, and I'm not trying to reduce it to its basic function, we're human beings. And once again, we deserve the right to have fair housing. Christina.
Christina Cardone.
Hi,
Good morning.
good morning. What I was thinking, echoes a lot of what Richard said along with everybody else. And I think that there can be very subtle differences that I think are based on implicit or unconscious bias that happen, especially because of the competition in the market, because sellers, landlords, and agents are trying to, make decisions about, which offer or which applicant is best and which client do you work with when we're all under a lot of pressure. And a lot of times, unfortunately, those decisions are based, like Beth said, on, someone's accent or someone's name or occupation or, things that decisions that some people, even very educated people, might think are objective, but they're actually based on bias. And I think that's happening a lot and most people are unaware of it.
Okay. And that plays right into where I'm going to be headed to before we conclude the need for trainings. Thank you so much, Christina. Let's go to Meredith and then let's end with Marilyn. Meredith?
Meredith Jacks.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Good morning.
Okay, good morning. So mine was more of kind of the result of the things that we aren't doing right. And that's just acknowledging the disparity in the differences between school districts that are neighboring that happen to coincide with the racial makeup of the community. And I very specifically work in a pretty tight circle around my office. And the district where I work is, or where my office is located is 13% not white. The neighboring community school district is 37% non-white, so 3 times the number of non-white residents. And this is just statistically, and I'm sure that these vary and don't have to cite the place where I got this information, but I was just kind of doing this information for my own knowledge. And I noticed that not only is it 3 times non-white in that neighborhood, but the median home price is a third of what it is in my district.
Wow.
And we are 50% renting in the other neighborhood and only 18% renting in my community. So these statistics are, I mean, it's not a coincidence.
No, thank you for giving us that data. Thank you so much. And then lastly, we'll go to Marilyn.
Marilyn Clark.
Hi, good morning.
Good
I
morning, how
just
are you?
wanted to say that it's just sad that working families, have to, deal with the discrimination or even think about neighborhoods that they know they cannot live in. That's really sad to see, and it still is happening in our society. So that's really all I thought about, discrimination within the real estate industry right now.
Yeah. And to Merida's point, the biases, the unconscious bias, to your point, Marilyn, which is, there are some that know that they're engaging in this, but hopefully, we can move to a level where we can be equipped with all of the things that we need to do to recognize it, to acknowledge it, to combat it. If we had more time and we were in person, I would break us off into groups and look at, have you ever reported an unfair housing practice? And what does that look like? We don't have time here, but have you ever reported an unfair housing practice? And then secondly, we can always talk about discrimination that someone else has. Oh, the bigotry that they have over there, the prejudice that they have over there. Oh, the white racism, the white anger, January 6th insurrection. What about in our communities? What about in our homes? I'm not in person today, Richard, but if I was in person, we would also look at a level of raising our level of humanity to engage in a form of self-introspection, to look at how oftentimes we may have been that barrier. We may have been that individual, mitigating, engaging in that discriminatory process. And then also the other aspect is being able to move beyond that. Paula, did you have an announcement with regards to the chat? I don't know anything about the chat.
No, someone commented that they can only see their own responses, and that is true. We have set it up that way, which is why Mr. Lassiter is reading out your answers as they come up. So just be patient, folks. Thanks.
Okay, next slide, Paula. Thank you. I didn't touch anything, Richard. So who's protected by the Fair Housing Act? We can go to the next slide because the first slide was the visual for that. And so I think it's very important for us to look at, what do fair housing laws cover? Sale and the rental of housing, housing-related transactions, the types of housing are apartments, single-family homes, mobile home parks, condominiums, public housing, nursing homes, dormitories, and more. Looking at two aspects, disparate treatment and disparate impact. Next slide. I want to stop here for a moment to say, when I first got to the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, I was coming from being the executive director of the American Red Cross of Southeastern Pennsylvania. And specifically, we had a house called the Red Cross House. It's the only house of its kind that serves as a disaster recovery center in the entire nation. So it's the only house within the flagship of the American Red Cross. So if you're displaced because of a catastrophic event, a fire, water main break, all types of households, not households of color, but all types of households throughout Southeastern Pennsylvania. Oftentimes we would find, looking at surveys and studies, did not have a smoke detector, did not have a smoke detector with a 10-year lithium battery, did not have a carbon monoxide tester because of rates of impoverishment. Individuals who, specifically in the Cambodian communities, the Senegalese communities, would have 5 homes set up with one particular generator for electricity. It's often been stated that Philadelphia is the city of neighborhoods, no matter if that's South Philadelphia, Italian community, African-American community, whatever community, Irish, Polak community. And so with these row homes, if 6612 was engulfed in fire, then 6613, 6614, so forth and so on, would all be part of that inferno. And so individuals would come to the Red Cross House. tangled title issues, didn't know that grandmom, when she passed the house down to you, that you had to continue to pay insurance and things of that nature. And so we would see a lot of the challenges once families would leave the American Red Cross house and go and work with community legal services and others, and they would go into the space of home ownership for themselves, or they would continue the process of trying to get loans, good credit and things of that nature, and would be faced with discrimination. I give you that as context because they're already dealing with the trauma of displacement. They're already dealing with the trauma of social vulnerability, right? Being as though I lived in North Philly, I lived in West Philly, I lived in South Philly, whatever the catchment area is, and they tend to live in those communities, work maybe in those communities, outside of those communities, but come back in those communities. So you had the trauma, the vicarious traumatization, and maybe losing a loved one. I don't want to sensationalize this or dramatize it, but a lot of individuals would leave out of the fire with their lives while their children died or while their loved ones died. And so you have all of this trauma. And then what we don't do, and I don't expect realtors to do it per se, but I think with training, we can look at it. We're not asking you to be social workers, social scientists, ethnographers, anthropologists, but looking at the human spirit from a standpoint of resiliency. That mother is homeless, that those 3 children are homeless. They lost their home because the landlord was trying to engage in sexual harassment. She couldn't pay the rent on time because she just got out of a relationship, or he couldn't pay the rent on time because he got out of a relationship. They're living in the car, but yet the children still go to school every single day. They're on the honor roll. There's factors of resiliency that we don't look at. But there's also, not looking at it from a deficit model, those challenges of those families, those individuals who, because of housing discrimination, we don't see the high rates of maladaptive coping. We don't see the stressors. We don't see the type 2 diabetes, intersecting with food deserts, intersecting with environmental racism, intersecting with economic injustice, being denied the right of a home with good credit, on the heels of being discriminated in the workplace because of the crown of your hair. I mean, all these things are taken into account. At the PHRC, I'm happy to announce that I'm holding in my hand our annual report of 2022. And when we look at the fair housing violations, the top complaints for us in 2022 were disability, retaliation, race, and color. Next slide. What is prohibited? The refusal to rent or sell housing, the refusing to negotiate for housing, set different terms, conditions, or privileges for sale or rental of dwelling. I'm not going to spend time on here because I know that from some of the responses I got from this robust group, you know what's prohibited. Next slide. Just a follow-up of some other things that are prohibited here: refusing to provide or discriminate in terms and conditions of homeowners insurance because of race, color, religion, sex, and those protected categories. Thank you, Paula. Next slide. I would imagine everyone here knows what housing discrimination is. Next slide. Mortgage lending discrimination, refuse to make a mortgage loan or provide financial assistance for a dwelling, refuse to provide information regarding loans, discriminate in appraising a dwelling, refuse to purchase a loan, refuse to make a mortgage loan or provide other financial assistance. And I know some of these slides might be a refresher, and some of you may consciously or subconsciously be saying, you're preaching to the choir, but sometimes you have to preach to the choir so that we can make sure that we're singing the accurate note at all times. Because sometimes we can forget some of these things, or sometimes these things can lay dormant in our neurotransmitters. We compartmentalize things because of some of the things that you mentioned in the chat and that you express outwardly, that we got to close this deal. I see that discrimination, but hey, I'm just one person. It's on an individual level. It's institutional. Systemic and structural racism. There's not much I can do with it. You know, hey, it's always been like this. There's a historical aspect that has found its way in the contemporary moment. You know what? They should have brought that paperwork in. Hey, listen, that I have nothing to do with that. Where's that additional pay stub? When I heard Marilyn earlier say, a lot of this is just straight blatant. A lot of this is unconscious, but a lot of this is blatant. And I'm not here to go back to that previous conversation of, you know, the bully metaphor, but more often than not, when someone is engaged in a form of discriminatory practices, they're not just totally oblivious to it. They're just not totally, there's a pattern. The violation of the Civil Rights Act, the violation of the Fair Housing Act. There's patterns of racism, there's patterns of redlining, there's patterns of displacing populations, there's patterns of engrossing on people and savaging and ravaging people's culture on all sides of the color line and gender line. And some of the things that you'll see me talking about as we come to a close for the Q&A, we'll get more to that. Next slide. So I think that one of the key things for realtors, for those in the housing space, is how do we build social change agents? And I gave a similar talk with GPAR earlier last year, where I talked about this very slide here, which is anti-racism training in housing. We already know about that, right? Richard can come and talk about, DEI training and what's happening, but do we ever talk about anti-racism training in banking and lending? Do we ever talk about anti-racism training in developing and construction? I was a professor at the University of Penn, 2 Ivy League degrees from University of Penn, but I lived in West Philadelphia and fundamentally recognized that West Philadelphia existed long before the University of Pennsylvania existed. Temple University sits in the heart of North Philadelphia. That community existed before Temple University, LaSalle University, and we can go on. We can look at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. We can look at Columbia University in New York. And so we're not saying, and I'll personalize it, I'm not saying that developers should not engage in development. But what if we had frank conversations about the savaging and ravaging of communities and looked at the examples that have occurred so that we can have anti-racism training and developing and construction? And here's the other thing too. We've made things out to be, if you're a racist, you're a bad person. Well, I like the fact that the way you all had written this up, Richard, was let's acknowledge, let's recognize, and then let's do something about it. So if there is racism in construction, well, let's have some anti-racism training. I'm not saying that training can legislate or change the hearts of men, women, and others. I'm not saying if you have anti-racism training in how systemic and structural racism goes away, or the things that Ronstein talked about in Color of Law, where redlining and things of that nature go away. But if we give people the information, they will do with it what they can. But if we create some social justice change agents in housing, then far few in between will be those individuals who in the housing, banking, developing, construction, appraisal, and underwriting can continue to engage in forms of systemic and structural racism, because the social change agents are there to simply say, wait a minute, this is my client, and I know that this is a major transaction and major deal, but I have to look at the fact that I ran my own aggregate. I ran my own qualitative and quantitative data, and this appraisal is something that's wrong here. There's a deeply rooted bias in here, and then we also can make sure that we in the training of anti-racism do not get seduced into the black-white binary. When I first got to PHRC, Richard and colleagues, I asked Black staff and white staff, where are whites in the Commonwealth who are discriminated against for housing? Executive Director Lassiter, what do you mean? Like out in Western PA, like, in the trailers? I said, no, in Philadelphia, in Pittsburgh, in Chester, in Montgomery County, in Dauphin County. Not what John F. Robert Kennedy did when he went down south and he saw poor whites in Mississippi and the Dakotas. No, we're talking about every day, right? We do know that we see it primarily within people of color, but we also have to be mindful that it happens on every side of the color line and gender line. So once again, in recapping, I think we build social change agents by having anti-racism training, different from DEI training. I think DEI training is necessary, but anti-racism training gets to the underpinning of the historical aspect, prejudice plus power, and how that is utilized to disadvantage many. Next slide. I do want to be mindful that there is room. There is room for DEI trainings. I don't want to dismiss DEI trainings. There is room for unconscious bias trainings, because I don't come to the context thinking, let's have anti-racism training because everyone in housing is racist. We need to have DEI trainings, but then the DEI trainings help us get to the fact that we need to look at it from a systemic and structural standpoint. Women, minority-owned businesses and developing and constructions and labor. And that means for us who are male and privileged because of cool polls and machismo and toxic masculinity, what are we going to do with that? That does something to us. And we're not saying we need to give up our male privilege, but how do we leverage it on behalf of others who are not at the table of justice? And then I'm not an expert here, but some of the literature I was reading talked about incentives for reporting unfair housing violations. That's kind of controversial, right? That's almost like, you have an indifferent cop, and then you have a cop that knows that this cop is indifferent and planning drugs and engaged in all types of just unlawful behavior. Does that cop who's not like that other cop break through the blue wall of silence, the institutional racism of silence? Well, same thing in housing, right? Those of us who are on this call, we know of some individuals who have engaged in forms of discriminatory practices along the indices of housing and appraisal and all types of things as it pertains to housing. Do we speak out? And that's more Socratic. But this article I was reading 2 weeks ago in preparation for this presentation talked about instead of reporting unfair housing violations, and then ultimately penalties and fines, levying penalties and fines, not being punitive towards people, but holding people accountable. Next slide. I'm coming to a close so that we can open it up for some questions that Richard had. But I'd be remiss if I once again did not acknowledge our PHRC Speaks Fair Housing in the 21st Century. Director Garcia this past Sunday had a topical discussion addressing the housing affordability crisis. He had none other than Chip Gallagher, sociologist extraordinaire, one of my former Fox News, 29 Fox News in Philadelphia, nothing against the other Fox News. Those are colleagues as well. But Dr. Gallagher used to be the chair of the sociology department at LaSalle University, and he's now just a professor of sociology. Next slide. Wanted to just talk to you briefly about some of the trainings and offerings that the PHRC provides, civil rights and filing a complaint. We also have preventing discrimination in the workplace and schools, bias, diversity, equity, and inclusion, fair housing rights. Look at just what we're doing in fair housing fundamentals, fair housing for LGBT individuals, fair housing for municipal leaders, fair housing in criminal backgrounds, fair housing in domestic violence, fair housing in individuals with disabilities, fair housing and hoarding. We never really take that in consideration. Service and support animals. Oftentimes pets serve as that conduit to help people lift their heads out of depression and things of that nature. Next slide. Excuse me. We also have Fair Housing Month. And I want to start again by simply saying happy Fair Housing Month to each of you. On April 14th, we have reasonable accommodation presentation. April 21st, assistant animals. April 28th, fair housing and hoarding. Next slide. Fair Housing in Action Forum today. I'm glad that Richard and Paula reached out to me. Once again, Director Garcia, he's just amazing. He's going to be at the United Lutheran Seminary in Gettysburg doing this talk today with regards to fair housing and building coalitions from a structural standpoint on a macro level, meso and micro. Next slide. Beyond the headlines, coming together to address appraisal bias. You have the PowerPoint, it's Zoom on April 12th, 2023. Jeffrey may be someone that some of you know. You may know all three of these individuals. Dr. Howe, she comes out of the University of Illinois, highly respected in the field of just talking about addressing and redressing inequality, understanding the roots and contemporary manifestations of racial inequality and appraised values, right? This is nothing new. It's coming to the context and the forefront from a media standpoint, because at our disposal, what do we have? I'm sitting here with 2 cell phones. We have the World Wide Web that's allowing us to get more information, but appraisal biases have deeply been problematic in American democracy. They've been baked into institutional racism for a considerable period of time. Next slide. PHRC fair housing trainings, redlining yesterday and today, historical, contemporary, accessibility in fair housing, You see that date is going to be May 31st, and then Fair Housing Fundamentals is going to be in June 28th as well. Next slide. I think this is very important for those of you who may be avid readers, or you don't want to be labeled, right? Because I don't want to come into this space labeling anyone. But In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, How Universities Are Plundering Our Cities, talks about what's happening at the University of Penn, what has happened at Georgetown University, on the outskirts, George Mason, on the left, on the southeastern side, you have American University and multiple other universities. Really a good read. You'll see some of the things that we talked about here. You'll think about some of the challenges. Thank you for being here, Anne. I know you have to go, but thank you for being here. Next slide. The Color of Law, Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. That's institutional racism. So we're not blaming realtors that are on this call. What Ronstein talks about is institutional racism. The government set up the system of disadvantage. Next slide. Massey talks about this. So Ronstein is a 21st century version. Massey is still 21st century version, but Massey talks about American apartheid. He's a mutual colleague of mine at Princeton University, sociologist. He's emeritus right now. Segregation and the making of the underclass, right? So it's not the concept of, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, right? Systematic racism that created the underclass, the underbelly, the urban ghettos. Next slide. A lot of this is germane from a historical standpoint with Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, the first African-American to get a PhD from Harvard University. He was the founder of the NAACP with a lot of his Jewish colleagues. He penned The Philadelphia Negro, the first sociological study of its kind of Black life in Philadelphia in the Sixth Ward, which is primarily known today as Kevin Bacon, the actor's dad, was a beautiful architect who developed a lot of the brownstones there, but Du Bois talks about the disadvantage from a systemic and structural standpoint in the Philadelphia Negro. Next slide. Just books that I think that would be really good for this group, Richard. Black and White Spaces. Elijah Anderson talks about the creation of the ghetto as well. He talks about, the school aspect of funding. He talks about a lack of food deserts because of the lack of supermarkets. Really good book. Next slide. Gentrifier by Mark Lamont Hill and his colleagues just talks about gentrification in the Brooklyn area, redlining, blocklisting, and all of the challenges that we have discussed here, and that I'm certainly sure that you're aware of. Next slide. We can go to the next slide. And so I end, as we turn it over to Richard for Q&A and just a frank discussion, is what you all invited me for. Let's make unfair housing history. And this slide talks about unfair to fair and equitable. That's where the paradigm shift, I believe, comes in at. Next slide. Q&A. Turn it over to you, Richard.
Chad, thank you so much. I do want to take a second and just talk about that great list of books that you shared with us. And I want to remind everybody that the Pennsylvania Association of Realtors, through their diversity committee, has a virtual book club. They do 3 books every year. Some of the books that Chad shared with us have been topics of those discussions. Please go to the PAR website to find out more about the book club and how you can participate in that. So we are going to open this up for Q&A. We have around 20-some minutes left. Please use your chat box if you have a topic or question for Mr. Lassiter. I'm going to start this off with something that's ripped from the headlines. For those of us that get the PAR just listed emails every day, today's I thought was quite topical because the headline is Pennsylvania Fair Housing Organizations receiving grants from HUD. And within that article, they note that the Housing Equality Center of Pennsylvania, we all know that's our neighbor in Fort Washington, received 2 grants, one for $125,000 for education and outreach initiatives, and $425,000 payable over 3 years for private enforcement to carry out testing and enforcement activities. Now, Chad, in testing, it's something that everybody should be aware of, and everybody should be a little afraid of almost, because you could be tested really at any time. Could you talk to us a little bit about how the enforcement of that works?
Yeah, certainly. Really quick, Paula, if you could go back to the slide that has my information, Cheryl put in the chat a request for information for that slide to be up for a little bit longer.
Excuse me, I'll put the contact information in the chat. Is that good?
Okay, no problem. So Richard, I think that I haven't seen the article, but one of the things that I think is very important from the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission perspective is the follow through with enforcement. And so one of the things that we do is when the violation of the Fair Housing Act is reported to us, and I didn't have this slide, so extended apologies, but you should be filing a complaint with regards to the violations with HUD. There is a link and there is a number for that. I can send that to Paula or to the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. But in summary for us, the enforcement aspect is holding people accountable once we know. And then there's a whole entire process, investigative process that goes into that as much as I can share. But I'm willing to ask others, you know, what's the nature of the testing violations that you see and what's the recourse? Who do you take that information to? Right? Because we're very clear on our end that prior to the pandemic, we had partnered with Angela MacGyver, I believe, and some others. Might not have been Angela. I don't want to speak out of term because a lot of us know Angela. But we partner with a lot of individuals as it relates to testing. And then the pandemic hit. But the reality for us is that I think that we have to be ever vigilant to make sure that there's not a pattern. So there are some individuals that it's the same realtor over and over. And when we become aware of that, I think that we have a right and a duty. We're bound by the law to actually engage in making sure that we bring that to the authorities' attention.
So I think after everybody is aware of the Newsday investigation that went on in Long Island and how embarrassing it was, to be very blunt, to our profession to see what some of our colleagues are doing. Chad, when people are tested, what are some of the potential ramifications that can happen to realtors who are tested and found to be discriminating?
Good question, Richard. I think you would probably know that more than me. I'm not privy to that aspect, but I think that one of the things that comes to mind when you mentioned it was rather embarrassing. I think that every profession is a microcosm to the larger society, right? And so we look at it and we say, wait a minute, I can't believe that police officer did that. I can't believe that teacher used the N-word. I can't believe that principal was anti-Semitic. The realtors, the real estate agencies are not racist themselves. They're made up of people that come in with their biases, right? And so every time you see a headline of your industry, it's like, oh gosh, well, when I see certain things that happen in our industry, I'm not amazed because we have brokenness in every aspect of this republic. The republic is, in itself, some may argue, is somewhat broken. I think one of the things that I would rather us to do is to see these headlines and simply say, how can we address that? I think there needs to be more op-ed pieces coming out of this space. I think there needs to be more research, more book chapters. And I'm not saying there aren't, but I think that there needs to be more of that. But to the question that you asked, I don't have an answer to that.
Okay, thank you. Again, people, if you have questions or topics you'd like to discuss, please use your chat box at the bottom. Right now, I'm going to come to another one that is, I think, very topical and important, is when we talk about housing attainability and affordability. Now, I did a quick search this morning and found out that the median household income in Pennsylvania is a little bit above $63,000 per year at the household level. Now, that is currently around 3 times the poverty level. Now, we also, as real estate professionals, can see that people are wanting rental housing that they can't find. Now, for a family making around $64,000 a year in Pennsylvania, looking at 30% being that magic number of what they can spend on housing, that means per month they can afford around just shy of $1,600 a month for their rental housing. Today, through our multiple listing service, there are only 2 rentals that would be less than $1,600 per month north of the Pennsylvania Turnpike in our suburbs. There are only 3 that would be less than $1,600 that are west of the Blue Route in our western suburbs. Chad, do you see this as being some sort of institutional discrimination where people of more modest means just can't find housing?
Great question. I'm a researcher as well as an anthropologist and ethnographer. I would have to dig more into the data that you found. What we do know is by those numbers, you're talking about increased rates of homelessness. You're talking about the inability for people to possibly have a roof over their head based on the data that you ended up providing. I'm not going to go on record by saying that it's a form of institutional racism. I'm not going to negate that it may not be. I would just have to see more of the data. But I can tell you what you just reeled off is certainly alarming. We're talking about a populace that oftentimes is not making a living wage to pull themselves out of the miry clay of poverty. With the data that you just shared, how can someone thrive?
And opening this up to everybody on the call, are you saying the same thing? Are you working with clients who want to be renters, who want to be homeowners, that at the current time, because of the current market, you're just not able to help? What are your thoughts on that?
Someone put in the chat too, great question, Richard. Someone put in the chat exactly homelessness. But let's get to Richard's question. But the person that put in the chat homelessness, I would like for you to expound upon that.
Okay, and that was
Tahira.
right.
Do you want me to unmute her?
If you could.
All right, give me a second.
Didn't mean to call you on the spot, Tahira.
That's okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Yeah, so that's exactly what's happening. You know, I've had quite a few rentals this year, and even people who've calling me, they just can't afford it. You know, these are working people. They've been at their job for years, but they just are not meeting the income qualifications that these homeowners are expecting these renters to have, especially in low poverty areas. So it's forcing people to even move back in with their homes. A lot of times where I'm from, even the older mothers are not in position that they have their own home. So it's just creating a space for homelessness. You know, you have young parents who have children, you know, this one client I just had, she was like just shy, and I mean just shy over like towards that she couldn't be on low income housing, but she could not afford regular housing. So, you know, she called me, she was very upset, but she had to move back in with her mom, because if your credit score is not up to, you know, some people want to get 650, 700 credit scores, you know, that's okay. But, you know, when it comes to the income qualification, they just can't meet it. So, you know, they have these little children, it's creating homelessness because they're moving back in with their aunts, uncle, cousins, friends. The houses are getting crowded again. It's just, you know, unfortunately, it's happening and it's real.
Thank you. I love those comments. Paula, if you could unmute Meredith. Meredith, thank you for being such a quick typist. Your comments are great. Now, couching this with, of course, we cannot talk about any commission items because of antitrust issues, but you bring up an interesting point about trying to push more charges onto the buyers while they're already stressed in today's market. Talk about that a second, Meredith.
Sure. You know, the information that's kind of been coming down the pipeline about the commission's lawsuit and what that means to our industry is less concerning to me when it comes from a worried about what's happening to our industry as opposed to what's going to happen to our buyers. The conversation saying that, at this point in time, a lot of the time the sellers offer commissions and buyers get that representation. There's a concern to me that if the responsibility of providing buyer representation falls on the buyer, that there are going to be a lot of people that aren't going to be able to afford good representation. And I do think it's going to negatively impact the BIPOC community on a much greater level than I think people may be realizing. So that's something that's just on my radar, is wanting to make sure that everybody has access to the right kind of representation. And I see this as something that really could negatively affect certain people more than others.
Thank you, Meredith. And someone just recently, Richard, put a correction in the chat that they had remarked 2 families living in a 3-bedroom, but now 3 families. And so when you talk about generational living, against the backdrop, you juxtapose that with generational poverty. There's a lot of stressors there. One of the things that we didn't really unpackage is that we also faced a pandemic where people were laid off, right? There were people who actually died. So if that breadwinner of that household died, then someone is left to their own devices. Also, what we also see is another looming recession that we don't talk about. But if we were to really be very frank with one another, the London Financial Times and The Economist talk about that recession that we're actually in. And so lots of challenges there, and especially with the communal living. Now, some people, that's a cultural thing. Some families, they live, but when we're talking about not having enough space, and you talk about a landlord that during the height of the global and historical pandemic was saying to individuals, and we have this when we look at domestic violence or intimate partner violence in housing, when we look at sexual harassment in housing, you pay your rent, I know you're late, it's okay. Why don't you go ahead and give me this sexual favor? More forms of trauma.
I love the fact that Gwen, and Paul, if you could unmute Gwen brought up this topic of multi-generations or multi-families living in homes that perhaps were not designed for that. That was one of my topics today. We have a hodgepodge of laws in Pennsylvania and federally that talk about sometimes limiting the number of people that can live in a specific dwelling unit. I know HUD has guidelines on how many square feet per person should be in an ideal residence. Chad, do you feel that some of the laws in Pennsylvania that may be worded in such ways like no more than 3 unrelated people can live in any dwelling, do you find that some of those laws do impinge on people's freedoms, cultural freedoms, or perhaps even cross that line into being a little discriminatory?
In a recorded presentation, Richard asked me a question that he knows that I can't answer because I need to keep my job as the executive director of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. So we're going to go to Gwen Richardson. No, I'm not putting you on the spot, Gwen. No, I think that it needs to be looked at. And I said earlier that I don't placate, ingratiate, display of false generosity. I think it's a great question, Richard. I think that once again, we have to be able to look at the cultural norms of multiple families, because there are a lot of families from a cultural perspective that this is seen as the way they live, right? I think that one of the things that we have to do is we have to look more into this. We have to have a very frank conversation, and we have to really look at those laws. And I think that we sit down in a social justice milieu with the individuals who created the laws, with advocates in housing, with those of us who are family advocates as well. And we just look at it. Brofenbrenner talks about looking at it from a mesosystem and ecosystems and how the systems are integrated and intertwined with one another. So I think that we need to have everyone sitting at the table having a frank conversation about that, because we don't want to discriminate against individuals. You don't want to discriminate against anyone because they're saying, hey, I'm not going to rent to you because you have children, or because you're LGBT, or because you have a support animal, or because, it's a grandmother, it's a great-grandmother, grandfather, great-grandfather, and you have multi-generational, or whatever the case may be. So I think we need to have a more nuanced conversation about it so that we can put all the parties at the table so that we can make sure that there's equity for families who may not live in our Americanized Anglo-conformity acculturation manner.
Thank you. Gwen, does everything that Chan just said, does this approach to answer what your question was, or are you seeing people coming to you looking for housing for multiple families?
Yeah, there was two separate thoughts in that. The lack of available housing or apartments to rent for a single mother family. Now they are immigrants where they are used to several families living. So, you know, a church member will say, okay, move in with me while you save your money to buy a house, but you know, there's not enough houses out there. She can't afford to rent now with just one income. However, they don't want to continue to live that many people in a you know, family. She would like her own. But it goes both ways. But I just feel like there should be some accommodation for that. Like they are in a town where they're not supposed to do that, but they don't have a choice. And it is somewhat dangerous. I don't know if anybody remembers I think it was last Christmas, where there were 3 sisters and a mother, and all of them
In
had children in the
Philadelphia,
fire. Yeah.
And that was actually a housing authority rental unit. I think
PHA,
this is a great topic to perhaps invite Chad back with and talk. We have just a few minutes left. I do want to perhaps put Chad on the spot with Janine's comment about property taxes. So as we know, again, in the news today, recently, the Pennsylvania Superior Court, I believe it was, just said that the way that we handle property taxes is unconstitutional. Of course, they did not give any options on what could replace the current system. So Chad, putting you on the spot, in light of the fact that the court has said that our current system is unconstitutional, do you see the PHRC getting involved with helping to form a replacement system?
I think it's a great question. I love the fact that you put me on the spot. I think that is a space that the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission under Director Adrian Garcia needs to look at. It's definitely something that is worth looking at. I think that there is so much that we're going to be creating. I hope that answers your question. I do want to leave you with this. We do know that there has to be an intersection between housing and education against the backdrop of the PA Supreme Court ruling of the school funding formula, and that property taxes are a driver for school funding in certain catchment areas. And so there's a way to, once again, balance things from an educational standpoint to get our schools to be adequately funded that can then drive better housing and better communities that will afford an opportunity for everyone to have adequate education in a global market economy and not be on this white collar factory coming out with limited or no skills, because a housing stressor has parents working on how they can make ends meet. And that's on every side of the color line and gender line. Children are going into schools. They don't know what the countertransference is. They don't know what the projection is. They just know that mommy and daddy don't seem to be happy, or they seem to be stressed, or they can't check my homework. So I think that I'll end by simply saying I live in a community of East Oak Lane in Philadelphia, which is borderline Melrose. And when you go up to Melrose and you go up to Jenkintown and you go up to Abington and you go up to Willow Grove, the property taxes, I look to my left one day and then I look back to my right, and the Cheltenham High Elementary School was rebuilt. It's like it was demolished and it was built up to the ground, you know, like in less than 2 years. Property taxes drove that. Accountability within the parent home associations drive those things. So I think that one of the things is, from a PHRC perspective, our director of fair housing commercial property. I would imagine that he has this on his radar, and I'm not saying that just for the moment, but I am excited to simply say that I'll be sending you, Richard and Paula, the PHRC Fair Housing White Paper, where that paper is going to be released, and we're going to be having a press conference in the Capitol relatively soon that really encompasses a lot of things as it relates to affirmatively furthering fair housing, what to do to combat fair housing violations, and just really sole source sole source income, and all of the things that we think that are really germane to making housing vital and forms of equity and equality for the people of the Commonwealth.
But we look forward to seeing that paper, and we promise to share that with our members. We have reached the end of our time today. Chad, I can't begin to thank you on behalf of the Tri-County Suburban Realtors for being with us today. I know that everybody on this call is going away with some new knowledge, and we certainly do look forward to you coming back at some future time so we can continue this conversation. For everybody on the call today, thank you so much for being involved. And with that, Paula, do you have some closing remarks?
No, just echo the sentiment. Thank you, Mr. Lasseter. We appreciate it. Thank you, Richard, for moderating today. And this recording will be available on our website before the end of the day. Thank you.